Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. My name's Susan Leahy. I'm the co-director here of the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies. On behalf of my co-director, Dr. Andrea Ryan, who couldn't be here today, I'd like to welcome you first and foremost to the School of Law, and secondly to this very exciting event which we're having here this morning. It's really fantastic to see so many of you here. I won't keep you too long introducing you to the centre, but the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies was first set up here 20 years ago as a Centre for Criminal Justice. We renamed it in 2015 as the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies. So I'm particularly delighted here for today's event, perspectives on hidden victims. And we're very excited really at the moment in particular about this event because we've Dr. Sean Redmond, who's recently joined our staff here on secondment and from the Department of Children, and also Dr. Johnny Connolly, who's here as a postdoctoral researcher. And I think it's really copper fastened I suppose how innovative our centre is, and given us a new branch to our armour really, which is an increasing interest on victims and on youth justice. So just to introduce this morning's event, it's a two-part programme, as you know, and I think again that's really exciting and very innovative this morning. We have three fantastic speakers, Dr. Sean Redmond and Dr. Johnny Connolly from our own centre, but also I'd like to particularly welcome Dr. Nicola Carr and thank her for making the journey here to be with us. And I'm very excited to hear the three papers. This afternoon, I think, as well, is a really exciting event and one I'd love to have been involved in if I was a PhD student still myself, which is our masterclass on methodology. And I suppose having supervised PhD candidates and being involved in Viva examinations, method is so important. And in particular, when you're dealing with sensitive audiences and people that could potentially either be bettered or harmed by your research, I think having the right method is so important. So it's a really exciting initiative and an innovative initiative, so I hope you all enjoy that in the afternoon. Catherine has asked me to remind you that if you are a tweeter, that we have a hashtag hidden victims, and that you can follow the research that is happening here at the moment in relation to Greentown at Greentown, at 17 Greentown. So make sure you have a look at that. I'm not a tweeter myself, so I won't be much use to it. So our first speaker this morning is our own Dr. Sean Redmond. His paper is entitled "Why We Should Be Bothered About the Influence That Locally Based Criminal Networks Have on Children." His presentation is based on the Greentown study and the influence of criminal networks on children's offending behaviour in Ireland. That's a study that was conducted between 2010 and 2014. Sean is an adjunct professor of youth justice here at the School of Law, and I'm sure he'll do a far better introduction to his presentation than I will, so I'll hand over to Sean now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks. Before I start, I just want to say a couple of thank yous. The first thank you is to the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and the Department of Justice and Equality, who funded the original study and are also now funding the follow-on study, and also a process of program design that we hope will try and make some useful interventions in relation to children who are caught up in criminal networks. So these people are usually kind of faceless bureaucrats, but Tony and Paddy, you might just stand up and just show yourselves to the people. I also want to say thank you as well, a particular thanks to colleagues in An Garda Síochána. And as you'll see when we go through the slides, the research, the initial research and the research that we're planning to do certainly couldn't have been done without their full support from the top to the bottom. There's also one other person I want to say thank you to is Barry Coonan, who is the Garda analyst. Barry's sitting around somewhere. There he is there. And even though the study, the Greentown study, has my name over it, it has Barry's imprint, as you'll see when we look at the slides. So I want to say a thank you. One final thank you is to my colleague, Owen and Mara Daly. And I know it's customary to say thanks to the people who've organised the events at the end of the event, but I'm very forgetful. And I'm pretty sure that nothing can go wrong now, Owen, so we can plough on with that. Okay, so my story starts back in 2010 when I was the head of young offender programs in the Irish Youth Justice Service. And one of the jobs I had to do, as well as number crunching, was to get out and to talk to people. At that time, the Department of Justice was spending about 16 million on Garda youth diversion projects. And a really good source of intelligence was to go out and talk to project leaders and local juvenile liaison officers, local Garda, about what crime looked like in local communities. And this story here was a really kind of compelling one. Back in 2010, we were at a point at which we were starting to get a handle on the data and starting to identify some patterns around youth crime, which were pretty similar to international comparisons. But there was one or two stories that kind of really jarred with me, and this was one of them. And this was from a really seasoned youth worker in Dublin. And she was telling me the story about a 16-year-old boy that she'd been working with over quite a long period of time. And this 16-year-old boy had ran away. The reason he ran away is that he had ran up drug debts with a local drug gang. Not surprising, I suppose. But the last part of the story then, or the next part of the story, was the one that really kind of shook me. I suppose both as a professional involved in policy, but also as a parent as well. What the youth worker said to me was that his mum had phoned him wherever he was and asked him to come back and take his beating. And it wasn't a beating from the family, it was a beating from the drug gang. And the reason that she'd asked him to come back was that the drug gang had made their life a misery. They had been calling death threats, smashing the place up, and generally making their lives completely miserable. And this kind of ritual of coming back to take the beating was in some way some kind of perverse incentive to make everything okay again. And I actually thought, as I say, as a policymaker, somebody involved in programs, and particularly as a parent as well, this is like bizarre, even though in some ways you can kind of see the rationale behind it, or that there's some rationale for her asking her son to come back. From a policy point of view, I just felt it was something we couldn't stand over, and it was something that we needed to inquire into a little bit more. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to talk a bit about the context for the study, where it fits in with the rest of youth justice research. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about methodology, which is why it's so small. Methodology I'm going to save for people who are coming to the masterclass this afternoon. I'm going to major on the findings of policy relevance, and I also want to bring you up to speed in relation to the new study and the programme design exercise in 2017. Okay. So I suppose the good thing about the things that we were starting to understand back in 2010, and I think it's still a continuing pattern as well, is that the data seem to indicate that young people grow out of crime. You know, so by and large, by the time that young men in particular get to 19, 20, 21, the age crime curve seems to dip, and for whatever reason, young people seem to grow out of crime. Loads of different theories posited for it: brain development, taking on more responsibility, socialization. But the actuarial data, this is based on detections, which obviously has some kind of limitations, but tends to show that the majority of young people grow out of crime. It's a really strong data set as well. So the fact that we have one police service for the whole country means that it's almost like kind of census data. This is all the young people who go through the diversion program who've been detected, and takes us back, I think, Barry, to about 1999. So this is 57,000 individuals born in 1989, I beg your pardon, as they get older. It shows a very clear drop-off. Two things that are important about that. One is it means that our age crime curve isn't dissimilar to a lot of other jurisdictions. But also what it does is underpin a very robust diversion program that An Garda Síochána have been running since about 1963, showing that, basically, if we can get young people through to adulthood with as few scrapes as possible, then probably that's the best and most effective, most efficient response the state can make, as opposed to, in previous years, putting thousands of kids into reformatories. What we also know, though, is that a small number of young people are responsible for a high number of offences. So what this data show is that about 3% or 1,450 young people were linked to 53% of all offences, again using detection data. Again, shows this overall kind of very optimistic picture that most young people who do get in trouble with the law commit 1 or 2 offences, but a very small number of young people are responsible for a higher number of offences. And it's those number of young people that the data set is, or the data is much poorer about. They're smaller in number, their contexts are pretty unknown. So, in relation to the evidence from the literature, this is my poor attempt at a kind of a figurative bell curve. What it shows is that kind of normal offending for young people, and that either side of that norm, we've got quite a lot of data, numerical data, statistical data. So we know a lot about a lot. You know, so we know a lot about the young people who commit 1 or 2 or 3 offences, both in terms of the mainstream literature and also in terms of our data as well. So this is the kind of literature that brings about the risk and protection paradigm, or the risk approach to working with young people, which, you know, pretty robust really for young people who fit within that kind of that large category of young people. Also would be the kind of target group for evidence-based programs, because, you know, a lot of the young people present with pretty doable issues that can, you know, where interventions are pretty straightforward. The problem we have is with the small number of young people that I indicated, who have been referred to in the literature as the right-hand tail of the bell curve, if you like, who are involved in, as we've seen earlier, quite high degrees of offending behaviour, and about whose context is known very little about. Within that group then, there's a literature on criminal networks and communities. So in addition to the typical risk factors, anybody who's read Farrington and the likes will talk about low impulsivity, you know, parent ineffectiveness, delinquent peers, dropping out of school, early drug usage. But in addition to those, what this kind of literature talks about, usually smaller studies, are the pull factors or the opportunities for social capital for young people to get involved in crime. The push factors where there may be coercion. Niamh Hourigan talks about this idea of contested sovereignty, where in some neighbourhoods that even though there may be an official presence in relation to statutory agencies, the sovereignty is really contested by some other kind of powerful sources within the community, usually criminal gangs. But also then cultural factors which discourage pro-social behaviour, ambiguous relationships between residents and criminals, almost a natural order. See, Andrew's here now. I had a very kind of sobering conversation with Andrew used to be based in a Garda project in Limerick, and we were talking all the time there about how it was important to try and encourage young people to engage in pro-social behaviour. And one of the things he said to me was, that's all very well and fine. I don't know if you remember the conversation, Andrew, but you know, most of the kids that this young person is working with don't. And so he stands out like a sore thumb. So in a kind of counterintuitive way, the young person acting pro-socially is othered by the other young people that he's mixing with. And then finally, the kind of Greentown study is the first Irish study of its type in terms of using initially kind of Garda data to try and bound a picture of what a network looks like, and then examining that using qualitative techniques. So I said I wasn't going to mention much about the methodology. This is going to come up in the afternoon. But it's safe to say that we used a sampling technique which basically used offence types to try and identify a location, which ended up being Greentown. We used that data then to build a network map. I say we, my colleague Barry Cahoonan built it and provided me with a network map. All of the data was provided by the guards. So whether it was statistical data or data gleaned through interview, the Garda members were my data points locally in Greentown. We used a protocol that we developed specifically for the study called TwinSight, which I won't discuss now, but we're going to discuss this afternoon, which permitted us to be able to talk about individual cases without breaching confidentiality and anonymity requirements. used grounded theory and the constant comparative method to develop some themes. So that's the methodology, so I'm going to deal much more detail this afternoon. We're going to talk about the findings now. And the first finding was that there was a network operating in Greentown, and it included transactions and relationships between adults and children. For anybody who's read the report, you'd think, so what? Well, we know that now. But actually, when we set out on the study, what we had was the stories from the youth worker who was talking about the young man who had to come back and take his beating, and other anecdotes. That wasn't an isolated one. But also some data, or a hypothesis based on some types of offending behaviour where we thought that it was pretty unlikely that children and young people were likely to carry out that type of offence on their own. So we looked at burglary offences and drugs for sale and supply. There's more data on burglary offences because it's more easily detectable. But with both of those offences, we hypothesised that there needed to be some kind of collaboration, and it was likely that that collaboration could involve adults. So we didn't know when we set out. But this is the Greentown Network, and you might just permit me a bit of time. Take a look at it, and just permit me a little bit of time just to go through it, because it's important to just suppose deal with the detail on this. So it was prepared by Garda analysts at Garda headquarters in Dublin without any input from the researcher or from the local Gardaí. It was constructed linking individuals through common incidents involving both minors and adults. All the individuals had an address in Greentown sub-district during 2010 and 2011, and all offences occurred within the Greentown sub-district, so it was contained. The green link indicates that one or more burglary offences link the respective individuals. A red link indicates that one or more drugs for sale and supply offences link the respective individuals, and a blue link indicates another relevant crime type which link the individuals, which interestingly the Garda analysts put in for me because I think they thought that I wasn't going to make certain connections. They were trying to help me along. In fact, those connections were made, but that's the reason why the blue connections are there. Each network member was labelled with a unique identifier which took the form of a capitalised letter followed by a numeral such as A1, B1 and C1, and a colour denoting the gender and the individual's actual age and years. So there's 31 individuals, which is a combination of children and adults. One of the interesting things about this was bearing in mind that none of the local guards had an input into this. This was a desk exercise done by Garda analysts just on the basis of pulse data. One of the things I spoke to the guards about when I started the interviews was, give me a score out of 10. How accurate is this in terms of a picture of what actually happens? And they give it a score of about 7.5 on average. They said, this is pretty accurate actually. For somebody who doesn't know what's going on here, this is what actually happens. One of the things I should say, of course, is that there are two versions of this network. The one that the guards saw also had the names on it, so it wasn't just unique identifiers. But they also said that there were key bits of information that were missing in terms of making links, in terms of things like familial relationships, friendships, and other stuff that didn't make it onto the network. So the point I made, one of the points I made in the study was that even if we do nothing else, this is a really, really useful way of being able to map out the potential kind of risk areas for young people who are involved in very serious offending using an evidence-based technique. I don't know how costly it is in staff hours, but for the small number of young people who are involved in multiple offending, whether we think there may be adult collaboration, it's a really, really useful tool, even to get local officers or local support agencies to be able to mobilise around young people and try to help them to protect them. So this network map was closely examined by guards. There were 16 very experienced local guards that were chosen actually by the Chief Super because they had good knowledge of the individuals involved. And we used this network map to examine the relationships between them. And I think one of the things that's kind of different from this study than a lot of ethnographic studies is that it does bound it. It tries to kind of enumerate the number of people who are involved in this network rather than talking about themes in a vacuum. So here's what we found next. What we found was that the network was hierarchical. It generated powerful processes and underpinned a culture of compliance in Greentown. And this culture, in turn, helped to sustain the network. So when you look at a network like the one I showed you, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's pretty flat. It's two-dimensional. We're all involved in networks, whether it's a kind of a work thing or, some kind of sports club, the kind of things you can kind of join and then drop out. So when you actually look at the network, it looks fairly two-dimensional, fairly flat, and our next finding was that it certainly wasn't flat at all. And also, it wasn't the kind of network that you can kind of opt in and opt out of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now, partly through a few case vignettes, but then also through some of the themes that we found as well. So the main person in this network is a person we called A2. And A2 was unambiguously the leader of the network. I got to a situation where he was pretty distant from committing offences. There was a whole mythology around him. I was talking to Kieran in the car on the way up, and I've only just become aware of this kind of idea of memes on the social media, this idea, this kind of spirit. And A2 enjoyed this kind of mythological, subliminal quality that generated this kind of climate of fear in Greentown. He operated a money lending operation, which quite apart from the transactional kind of practice, also brought about obligations and repayments of debt. So it started generating these client-patron relationships. He used enforcement by middle-ranking associates, so he himself wasn't involved in enforcing any of the contract or enforcing any punishment. He was also seen to shape young people's behaviour as well. Young people looked up to him, revered him. At a distance now, I wouldn't know him that well. But I suppose from a community point of view, that residents and network members self-govern their behaviour. So it didn't have to actually, give a lot of effort to actually monitoring, controlling people. People tended to self-govern based on this culture that he'd created. And also, as you'll see now, gained the relationship with the Gardaí. He didn't have a fractious relationship with the guards at all. He had a very, on the surface of it, convivial relationship. B2, so A2, sorry, one of the things I wanted to mention was that A2 was a member of a core family, and that was a big distinction in relation to the study. And we'll see that there are two kind of categories of family and non-family, which I called associates. B2 was a family member who was 15 years old, was seen by many of the guards who I interviewed as the natural heir to this network. He was seen as using the family brand to underpin his social capital. So a lot of the grown-up residents, with their own families, will be scared of B2 because of the family brand. He was revered and feared by children on the home estate. So there's this kind of ambiguity that some of the guards talk about, which is some of the young people wanted to be with him, but also were kind of scared of him as well. That he's been cultivated to be less impulsive and have better self-management skills, not to attract the attention of the guards. And he mixed more with family members than associates. So even though he had a relationship with some of the kids who were involved in criminal activity, he tended to mix more with his own family and was involved in reprimanding others for behavioural breaches. D2 was another family member who was a 12-year-old, was seen as being encouraged in criminality, but was also sheltered. So a bit like B2 may have been seen as a bit of a risk in terms of impulsive behaviour, as being kind of sheltered. Has authority vastly disproportionate to his age, so would be seen as having a huge amount of authority in the locality that he lived in. I should just say, by way of a kind of by way of a sideline, that this is kind of anathema to me. My job before this was assistant director in Bernardo, so involved in children. So it's a very difficult thing to listen to this kind of commentary about children and young people. But I think genuinely the guards were feeling that the children who were involved in this did have this kind of effect on other community members of carrying this family brand and creating this kind of culture of fear. That model relationship with the guards on A2 and that children and adult residents were afraid was seen also as recruiting associate children to the network. So our first kind of associate is D1. D1 was the one who I thought, when I first looked at this network, was the one who was the centre. Sometimes when you do these kind of analysis, you look at the number of link points, and D1 was the one that stuck out. But actually, D1 was part of the middle management, along with A1 and D1, and up there in the left-hand corner as well. D1, A1, and E1 all came from very chaotic family circumstances, which is in direct contrast to A1, B1, A2, B2 and D2, who, even though they were involved in high levels of criminality, seemed to have a very close kind of family and supportive family relationship. This was very chaotic, involved in crime from a very early age. D1 really didn't have much choice. He lives in a housing park where not many people move in and out, and his older siblings were involved in crime with A2. He lives close to A2, so he lives in close geographical proximity. And the reason why he's got so many lines next to him for detections is he gets caught a lot. D1 wouldn't be seen as part of the inner circle in relation to the network, but would be used by A2 for certain jobs and also for enforcement. And with another middle-ranking person in the network, A1, would have been responsible for grooming children into the network. And I usually use the word grooming purposely because the same processes that I understand predatory behaviour for sexual offences occur is exactly the same as this. Winning people's confidence, trying to entice them into certain types of behaviour was exactly the same. I do think it's kind of grooming behaviour. F2, also an associate, very prolific offender, lives close to A1, another chaotic family background, and was involved with a burglary with an uncle at a very early age. He led a group of young people involved in burglaries and robberies and was significantly under the influence of D1 and A1. So part of his kind of entry into the network was a kind of party lifestyle, consumption of large amounts of drugs and alcohol with network adults. This guy here we call the little fella, and the little fella actually didn't appear on the network at all because he's too young. 12. I think he was younger than 12 when we were talking about him. But the reason he didn't make it on there was because he was below the age of below the criminal age, but he was kind of forced on there by the people I interviewed who said, look, we need to talk about this young person. We're really worried about him. He's going on this awful trajectory now. He's a very chaotic family background. His mom had a drug problem and dad wasn't present either. He'd spent time in residential care outside of Greentown, and during the time he was in residential care, A1 visited his mom just to keep that relationship going, so that when he came back from residential care, pretty seamlessly he went back into serious crime again. And he was called the little fella because he was small and was used in committing burglaries. So another thing then, I was saying about, something that might come through from the case studies, like say looking at certain people are more important than others. But when we actually looked at the data then, so 400 pages of data we got from the guards, and we actually used NVivo then to trace these unique identifiers and see, well, how often were people mentioned? When we go through all the interviews, we can actually count the number of people who are mentioned. And the people I mentioned there in terms of the case studies are amongst that group there in red who were mentioned far more than others over the full breadth of interviews. So an indicator that some people might be more important than others. But then also when we looked at doing a kind of a thematic analysis of issues that came up and traced them to unique identifiers, the same individuals you'll see from this pie chart, without exception really, were identified in relation to descriptions of power, leadership, and influence. So the same ones. And you'll see there's a little green one there at the side that says all others combined. So out of a kind of a network of 31, those small number of individuals were mentioned in relation to all these descriptions of hierarchy. We also did another kind of comparison which looked at categorizing individuals within the network about whether they had a blood relationship with the core family or not. And without going into detail, what this is, the blue columns are what we call family members, and the red columns were the non-family members or associates. And we looked at the relationships in relation to certain antisocial measures or antisocial references. And what it came across as is that the family members, tended to be pretty well behaved in relation to the authorities. And a lot of the kids who were involved in associate families had a very fractious relationship with authorities and with the guards. So we have an idea there of who the principal actors are of a small number within a larger network. And the other thing from a law enforcement point of view that I think is important is that, as I said, if we were to look at this network and from a policy point of view and say who should we focus on our attention on in terms of trying to suppress their activities, it would be D1, of course. It looks far more the prolific offender. And that's what Pulse disclosed. Pulse only disclosed the detections. It was only when we had the added intelligence from the guards that we find out really that the high-profile offenders here are A2, Z1, B2, D2, and F2. They're the ones who are involved, who carry the real kind of power in the network. I suppose from, that's kind of interesting from a sociological point of view, but in relation to crime, there's some interesting kind of Greentown national comparisons. And when we look at the data that we looked at before around, the repeat offenders, then only about 8% of young people nationally who are detected for offences commit 5 or more offences. When we look at burglary, which is a good reason, I think, why we picked burglary, that goes up to 15%. Burglary seems to be associated with repeat offending. So all the context that's below that, it's not just the offence category, but the whole context below it. When we look at Greentown, though, there was 75% of the young people involved in 5 or more offences. Now, there's a big kind of, health warning that comes with this, in that the number of children who are involved in the net was quite small. But I think as an indication, it's quite troubling both from a child welfare point of view and also from a law enforcement point of view. This is the Greentown Network and how it linked with what we call the bird's eye view. So the Greentown Network is the one that's in the ring, and the bird's eye view then linked all offences, not just burglary and drugs for sale and supply, but all offences in Greentown over the period. And you can see that outside of the burglary offences, there are connections there made by the key actors in the network and large numbers of other people as well. So what we say then is that taken together, the network acted to encourage or compel certain children into abnormal patterns of criminal behaviour. Right, I have a few kind of slides here now that I'm going to skip because I want to stick to my time. I'm going to say something about there, a bit of narcissism. Thumbs up for the lifting the lid on Greentown. Malcolm Sparrow from Harvard, thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's nice. Peter Nehru from Cambridge said it's a fascinating piece of work. Andrew Papachristos from Yale has done a lot of work on social network analysis, says it looks amazing. It really does look like a first in many respects, which inspired me to put the unicorn and the rainbow behind it. And James Densley's done a lot of this work as well, said great insight into how extra legal governance works with important child exploitation safeguarding implications. Got some different feedback from other people. I looked at the journal.ie because I'm kind of paranoid about these things. When the report was published, I went straight to journal.ie and got some feedback there. Mick Hannigan, why it took him that long to figure that one out, crazy stuff. After 4 days, you could have come to that conclusion. Shaka, 1244, a 4-year study into the bleeding, but it said beading, obvious. I could have saved them 4 years and told them everything in this article that they'd asked. And the last one, Science of Beer. I'm not familiar with his work, but what he said was file under useless pieces of research of the day. Well, there's an interesting kind of relationship there, juxtaposition between, high-minded social science and people who are probably more on a front end, people who know all this is going on. And I suppose what it meant for me then was, what are we going to do about it? People are talking about this stuff, and the people who experience it know exactly what's going on, and they don't need people doing more studies. Having said that, being a social scientist, we do need to do more study. So one of the things we need to do is gauge the national relevance, the national prevalence. So Greentown was a case study, so it was very, very local, and we need to see whether there's any resonance of that across the country as well. And also, one of the things that the Department of Justice and Equality required us to do, and also the guards were very keen on, was to start thinking about designing a new multi-agency intervention to do 2 things. One is about reducing network influence. And a lot of the international studies would say, in order to give these kids a chance, you also need to do something on the law enforcement side to release the pressure a little bit. And the second thing is about improving the resilience of associate children and families to withstanding network threat and improve their life chances. It's not just about remedial, it's about improving the life chances. So just something in relation to the national survey then. So this is currently underway. Catherine Norton is leading on this. Catherine. Catherine, yeah. Catherine's leading on this. She talked to Catherine about it. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary. It works on the assumption that we've got a really good diversion program, really good intelligence that comes through the diversion program, and we are using, in the same way as we used local Garda and Greentown as our data points, we're asking local JLOs who know their populations in their areas to act as data points there. So they have a really good kind of vision of all the young people in their localities, and we'll be able to, when we've constructed a survey based on the findings of the Greentown study, and we're asking them, does this register? To what degree? Do you know? Second thing we're doing is we're doing 2 more case study replications funded by Department of Justice and Equality, and we are actually got the benefit of better technology with this one. So Thomas Grund, Dr. Thomas Grund from UCD has given us a hand with doing some kind of fancier social network analysis. But we actually have a kind of a nostalgic attraction to the old Greentown network, don't we, Barry? Partly because it kind of, it was the bit that started the work off, but also we actually don't want the network to do too much work for us. We want the conversations with individual Garda to try and fill in the gaps rather than doing too much work. So 2 more case studies. And the next thing then is about the program. So the first thing is about kind of network disruption, and there's a lot being written about this, and a lot of it's kind of theoretical, and a lot of it's kind of limited trials, and 3 main kind of theories around what you do about network disruption. One is take out the top. So, well, that doesn't mean kind of take out the top. It means kind of concentrate your energies on the top. And that if you think about policing and other statutory agencies having a finite amount of effort, then your effort is best taken actually getting the person who's involved in the top. So in this case, it would be A2. The second one is going to the bottom is taking out the foot soldiers, so engaging probably with young people, so it kind of starves the network of a retail capacity that it might not have if there's no people to sell drugs or to commit burglaries. And then another one that says, well, probably what you're better off doing is taking out specific assets, so people who in the network who have specific roles or specific connections, it might be better to identify who they are and to concentrate your efforts on disrupting their behavior. A lot of this kind of stuff comes from the States. So pretty untested. And the other thing is that when we looked at the kind of Greentown phenomenon, if you like, it's not transitory. This kind of network has been around for 10 to 15 years. So it's part of the cultural fabric, so really difficult to disentangle. So this then, combined with the idea then of an intervention program, is that I suppose the point I'm making is that a lot of this stuff is kind of untested, and there's a kind of an ethical responsibility on us to do some kind of testing of whatever we're going to do. This is a painting from the 1600s by Rembrandt. It's called Storm in the Sea of Galilee, and I often use it for talking about how young people navigate their way through to adulthood. This is a time, Storm in the Sea of Galilee, when they used to go out to sea and they'd be taking on the gods really about whether they ever got to the place they were going to. They'd just, and they'd go out. And so this picture then, I think, is a really good kind of analogy in some ways of what it must be like for a young person having to deal with all the multiple risks that they have to deal with. But since this kind of boat went out, there have been some features that have come about which haven't tamed the tempest at all. They haven't stopped the number of hurricanes or whatever, but we've technologies that have helped to build resilience. So we've maps, we've sextants that help boats to kind of position themselves. We've weather forecasting, so we know now, when it's a good time to go out and probably a bad time when they went out, We also have kind of, new types of craft as well that can, get us through really difficult times, but also through the doldrums as well. We have things called bulwarks or bulkheads as well in boats, which means that if you get holed beneath the waterline, everything's not gone, and also then we have kind of rescue as well, So I suppose the point I'm making is that, rather than, as we would see with a lot of evidence-based programs, is kind of claiming that these programs are kind of self-contained and we can deliver a certain outcome. The reality of the fact is that we're dropping this into quite a dangerous open system, and perhaps one way of thinking about resilience is about how we can use the technologies that we develop in programs to really help that young person negotiate the risks that they face. That being said, though, we also have a responsibility to really test that out. A lot of this is theoretical, and also based on practice wisdom as well. So what we are going to be doing is we've put together a kind of a design team of experts, and we have a number of the Irish experts in the audience who are involved in the kind of practitioner side, also policy and programs and research academics as well. And we're going to do a number of things. The first thing is we're going to identify the problem. If you read any of the stuff around wicked problems, Horst Rottel, 1973, one of the things he says is really understand what the problem is. Before you come up with a solution, understand what the problem is. It was a really, really sobering conversation with a gardener in Greentown who said, Sean, he said, you can see how complicated this is. What they'll do is open a boxing club. So it's like really understand the problem, all the different kind of facets to it before you come up with a solution, and also get multiple perspectives on that. So we're going to have about 20 to 25 Irish experts giving inputs into what the problem is, and we're going to use Greentown as our focus for that. We also then need to identify what needs to change. So in kind of program building, we call this kind of theory of change. So what needs to change? How might you go about it? Where are the weaknesses in terms of the network, but also what are the kind of things that need to shift in terms of life chances for young people. But then we also use this deliberative process to stress test all the ideas. So a bit like Dragon's Den, as the ideas arise, the international experts then and our national experts will be saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Which means then before any program is let loose on the streets, that it will have been through quite a significant deliberative process, not just in relation to stress testing the program, but also in terms of very clearly defining what the problem is and what the theory of change is. So that's me. I'll be talking, let's say, a lot more about the methodology this afternoon, but thanks a million. Cheers.
Hello everybody, my name is Nicola Carr. I'm based in the University of Nottingham and I was previously in Queen's University in Belfast. Thanks to Sean for a fascinating presentation, a hard act to follow. I met Sean, I met him a good while back, but I heard him speak we had a criminology autumn school back in October last year where we talked about our various aspects of research. I'm going to be presenting today on research conducted in Northern Ireland on young people's experiences of paramilitary punishment and paramilitary violence. And I think that there are parallels to what Sean has talked about in terms of the influence of networks within areas, the hidden nature of young people's victimization as well, which is obviously the theme of one of the themes that we're covering today. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking about a particular project that I've been involved in with my colleagues Claire Dwyer and Siobhan McAllister in Queen's University Belfast. It was funded by the British Academy. And part of the impetus for us seeking to do research in this area in the first place was in light of the 20th anniversary of the ceasefires, the official ceasefires in Northern Ireland, which was around kind of 2014, 2015, which is when we got funding. And although there was this kind of dominant narrative of the positive transition into kind of post-conflict society, which if you look at all the kind of data in terms of major violence, etc., that is absolutely the case. But rumbling underneath this, there's this unsettled peace, and some of it has kind of erupted, I think, in relation to what we're seeing currently. In the fact that there isn't currently an agreed government in Northern Ireland, but also in the continued activity of paramilitary violence within communities. And at the time that we applied to do this research, at least this issue wasn't being talked about at the forefront of people's discussions. And there's elements of why that might have been the case, not wanting to unsettle the peace, etc. But we were coming across it in other research that we were doing in relation to young people's experience within the criminal justice system, where we were talking to young people who were involved in the criminal justice system, who had been adjudicated through the courts, who'd gone through restorative justice interventions, who were in custody, who themselves were telling us that alongside all these interventions, the formal justice system, they were experiencing this informal justice meted out upon them in relation to punishment within their communities. So all of these factors influenced us to look at this area. The criminal justice system in and of itself has been intimately linked to the process of conflict transformation in Northern Ireland. As part of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a review of the criminal justice system, which entailed looking at all the kind of different agencies within the criminal justice system. Separate to that, there was the pattern review of policing and the pattern report of policing, which led to the disestablishment of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the establishment of the Police Service for Northern Ireland. The Criminal Justice Review looked at all aspects of the criminal justice system, and in particular in relation to youth justice, it recommended the establishment of a new agency, the Youth Justice Agency, and that was established following legislation in 2002. But alongside that, in this legislation, it also set in place that restorative justice would be the main response for young people involved in the criminal justice system. So basically in Northern Ireland, as distinct from the Republic, if a young person is charged with an offence, pleads guilty or is found guilty, in court or the Public Prosecution Service are legally obliged to direct that young person towards a restorative justice conference. There are only a small number of exceptions where that is the case, if it's a very, very serious offence or if the young person is denying responsibility. But basically, the main measure for dealing with young people in the youth justice system in Northern Ireland is restorative justice youth conferencing. And this kind of notion of restorative justice being placed at the heart of the criminal justice system for young people was very much, for people who've written about this area, have talked about it being very much linked to kind of legitimacy of the criminal justice system. So bringing the buy-in of the community into the process of the administration of criminal justice. The idea of restorative justice, I'm sure many of you are aware, is that it's about restoring the harm caused by offending, bringing together community, the victim and the offender into a process where the harm is restored. Now there's lots of debates about whether that's attainable, but nonetheless that's very much linked to the heart of the youth justice system. So this notion of legitimacy built into the youth justice system, this notion of restoration, this notion of holding young people to account is very much at the heart of the process. As I said, when we went, and this is prior to doing our paramilitary study, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment, when we went in to look at young people's experiences of the formal justice system in a study that we did with young people in the Juvenile Justice Centre, which is the equivalent of children detention schools here, we were interviewing young people about their experiences of the criminal justice system. So these were young people in custody, and we did life history interviews with them, basically talking about their kind of trajectory of how they ended up in custody, what their plans were for when they were being released. We followed them up into the community to talk about, what happened to them, and a few of them obviously came back and forth into the custodial system. But what emerged from this research in the criminal justice system, and again we hadn't gone in to look at paramilitarism in any way, was that a significant proportion of the young people, more than half, in the criminal justice system in this particular research, alongside the criminal justice formal interventions, so the restorative justice, the detention, whatever they may have been, they also experienced significant experiences of intimidation, threats, beatings, exiling. So these are just two examples or two quotes here from young people involved in that study. So the first of these, Anthony, talks about being beaten up basically for involvement in antisocial behaviour in these areas. He described it, or as he said, being a wee dick, which is a particular Northern Ireland expression. Or Patrick, in the second example there, talks about being basically told to get out of his area because of his involvement in offending. So we're interested in the concept of punishment within the formal justice system, and a lot of criminology research does obviously focus upon that. And a lot of criminology research focuses on formal processing within criminal justice systems. Penal governance, how our criminal justice systems are operated, our penal institutions, prisons, community sanctions, youth justice, policing, etc., etc. But underneath that, there's all other forms of punishment that take place, and increasingly scholars are looking at this area. For example, in looking at how punishment takes place in kind of welfare sanctioning, particularly in the UK, so these quasi-penal measures. So alongside the formal punishment system, we have quasi-penal measures. But also underneath that, we also have punishment taking place in diverse settings. Hannah Moffat and Mona Lynch talk about we need to really focus on what constitutes punishment in diverse settings. And really, are our kind of broader criminological theories sufficient to explain on-the-ground punitive practices? And really, that's part of what we were looking at in terms of thinking about paramilitary punishments in particular. There's a range of non-penal but punitive measures. We'd be familiar with Ian O'Donnell and Ona Sullivan's work in the Irish context, talking about coercive confinement, for example. We've had lots of different ways in which we enact punishment or penality that isn't through the formal justice system. And also what we were interested in was this notion about between notions of exclusion and punishment. So punishment in relation to the young people that we spoke to, focusing on the most marginal and excluded. Potentially one of the famous quotes used about kind of youth justice, for example, is that by Barry Golson, famously, that it processes the children of the poor. We can all have different kind of takes on that. But also the kind of sanctions within the criminal justice system acting as exclusionary measures upon young people, and then underneath that, further punishment within their communities in relation to paramilitary punishment that we'll talk about. At the time we started this research back in 2015, as I said, this was bubbling under the surface. It's gotten more and more attention over time, particularly in the last couple of years. Kind of frequent headlines from some of the local papers in Northern Ireland. People being brought to be punished. Sean talked there about somebody being taking their beating, which is a kind of similar kind of resonance in Northern Ireland, and increased kind of visibility of this within the Northern Ireland context. So what do we mean by paramilitary activity? There are official definitions that are used by the Police Service of Northern Ireland. These are just some of the kind of categories that we would talk about. They talk about kind of broader categories of terrorist-related activity, which includes shootings, bombings, etc. So-called alternative policing within communities, and a range of punishments such as beatings and shootings for so-called offences of antisocial behaviour, areas like joyriding, criminality, drug dealing, and for informing or feuding. So there's an understanding that this takes place, and that is reflected in the PSNI produced these security situation statistics that document what's recorded or reported to them in relation to these kind of activities. So in these security situation statistics, which are published on a quarterly basis in Northern Ireland, we have information on any killing that's attributed to paramilitarism or terrorist-related incidents, any bombing incidents. But what we also have is data, official data from the police on casualties as a result of paramilitary shootings, or style shootings as they call them, or casualties as a result of paramilitary style assaults. And you see that in 2015-16, the number of paramilitary style assaults officially reported to the police were 47 attributed to loyalists, and 11 attributed to Republican paramilitaries. Now, we all know the issues with crime data. In particular, this type of data only reflects that which comes to the attention of the police. And there's lots of reasons, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment, why there's lots of kind of lower level activity, or not necessarily lower level activity, but activity happening that doesn't come to the attention of the police. But nonetheless, what this data shows us, and the fact that it's still being produced by the police in Northern Ireland, is that this is ongoing residual violence happening within communities in Northern Ireland post-ceasefire, post all these kind of official rhetoric about post-conflict. And within the police data, they helpfully provide definitions of what they mean by paramilitary style shootings or paramilitary style assaults. So shootings, they talk about the injured party is usually shot on the knees, elbows, feet, ankles or thighs, and the motive is supposedly to punish the person for antisocial activities. These paramilitary style shootings are generally conducted by loyalists or Republican paramilitary groups on members of their own community. And as assaults, it talks about the definition of assaults, and again this notion that they're committed in inter-community by people against their own community. Just an illustration of the type of paramilitary groupings that we're talking about in Northern Ireland currently. these are some of the ones in the different groupings. So the background to looking at this particular study on young people's experiences of paramilitary punishment was our sense that young people's voices within this weren't necessarily being surfaced. Certainly when we interviewed young people in our previous study within the criminal justice system, we uncovered and unearthed a high degree of paramilitary punishments and assaults upon young people. They would describe it as a result of their own behaviour, kind of provoked this attention within the community, this negative attention. But interestingly, of all the young people that we spoke to when we conducted research in the criminal justice system, none of these young people had reported these assaults or exclusions from their area to official authorities. So these kind of level of activity that was happening in the community wouldn't appear in those statistics that I showed you previously. Really, the type of incidents that appear in the police statistics were when a young person would turn up in A&E and it would be reported in that kind of place. But if any other kind of issues, it wouldn't appear in those statistics. So our study, funded by the British Academy, was looking at the way in which young people's lives were kind of informally regulated, especially those young people who came to the negative attention in communities because they were deemed to be antisocial. We were interested in the kind of double justice experienced by young people who may have experienced formal criminal justice sanctioning and then other sanctioning within their community in this informal system. And we were interested in the protections and supports available to young people in these situations. So the study had basically three phases. We chose three areas to research within Northern Ireland. And we determined our choice of area both by the PSNI data that I showed you there, which kind of gave an indication of the kind of levels of activity in different areas of Northern Ireland. So that was the public data available. We also had a project reference group that helped us kind of identify particular areas. And there was also kind of newspaper reports of ongoing, in local newspapers, of ongoing kind of activities within communities. We also wanted to ensure kind of diversity across different communities in terms of our choice of areas. In other words, diversity in terms of loyalist Republican communities, rural, urban. So we selected 3 sites, 2 in main urban areas and 1 in a satellite area. And we conducted community assessment interviews with key stakeholders in the community. So we're talking about police, youth justice agency providers, restorative justice projects, local politicians in some instances, to kind of get a temperature or gauge of what was happening in the area. We then interviewed or sought to interview young people who had some sort of contact or involvement or would have been aware of kind of paramilitary activity in their communities. And we did this, and I'll be talking in more detail in the afternoon session about the particular methodology, by identifying young people who are already connected in with services. And you can appreciate from an ethical point of view that that was important in terms of ensuring that young people had this kind of, protections around them if particular instances were disclosed, if they became distressed in interviews. And obviously there was a big confidential element in terms of participant safety. So, for example, we didn't snowball sample, which would be, asking young people, do they know of other young people who may be interested in participate, because we needed to kind of secure the safety of participants. So we interviewed 37 young people aged between 16 and 25 as part of our method. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of main thematic kind of findings from the study. And I think it touches somewhat on what Sean has said earlier, and also raises questions about, legitimacy of criminal justice institutions, perceived legitimacy of other types of institutions in relation to young people's feelings of where they can go for help, feelings about who controls communities, feelings about where sovereignty lies, as you mentioned there. I suppose the first thing to say, and this is a group of 37 young people engaged in lots of different services, lots of different areas, was the kind of extent to which they had been experienced paramilitary violence, both visibly in terms of actually experiencing family members being shot dead, as a 16-year-old described, experiencing friends who got into trouble around a drug debt, who subsequently died by suicide, as one young person described, and young people talking about, well, yeah, they exist in communities, but, if something happens to people in terms of punishment, they deserve it. This is the way things work in these communities. This kind of sense in which this is normal life, basically. The extent to which young people talked about within our sample, kind of really quite extreme violence that they'd witnessed, and the extent to which this violence essentially was normalised was something that was quite striking. And when we kind of tried to talk through with people, the interviews were very much focused on young people's sense, as I said at the research questions there, their sense of why, what the experience was like within their communities, whether they experienced it directly, indirectly, etc., but also in terms of what they felt was the kind of sustaining elements, or what were their attitudes towards paramilitaries within their communities. And they talked about, some of the functions, the positive functions as they saw it, of paramilitaries serving their communities. They talked about, basically that in some instances paramilitaries acted these kind of quasi-policing functions. So this same young person who'd experienced one of his friends dying by suicide as a result of being intimidated over a drug debt, talked about, paramilitaries help people in terms of, they will sort out if somebody's house is broken into. The second young person there, Natalie, talking about, it's different with the police. If you ring the police, they'd be like, oh, we don't know who it was. But because we're in a tight-knit community, they're more likely to be able to find out who it was, when it happened, and can give them a slap on the wrist or whatever they need done for it. So there's a kind of higher power or fear of them. So try and just get everybody in the straight and narrow, I suppose. And within these kind of narratives, this sense, and it came through in lots of different responses, I'm just putting some examples here, this sense in which on the one hand, paramilitaries were involved in quite extensive violence against young people in terms of regulation, but on the other hand, young people talked about, there's a legitimacy within the community towards paramilitary activity because basically they offer swifter, more effective justice than the regular policing. Young people talked about another example of police having to look for evidence or go through due process where actually you don't need to bother with that. If you talk to the paramilitaries, they'll just sort it quickly. And so there's all sorts of issues and problems there in relation to this kind of response. We also spoke to young people who talked as well about this notion that paramilitaries would be responsible for protecting their communities. And this, in some instances, is about protecting them from the other side. So obviously communities, paramilitaries protect us from Catholics coming into Protestant communities and wrecking them. Obviously the paramilitaries are there for a reason. Yes, there's a bad thing to do it, but without the paramilitaries, then your community would be fucked. So this sense in which, paramilitaries protected or provided this wider protection to the community in the context of concerns about broader state legitimacies. In the second example here, this notion of protection, Derek talks about paramilitaries are more like street people that protect the street. Fair enough, most people say with selling drugs and all that there. Yes, fair enough, they do that. But they're protecting the community. Say if rapists come into the community or if paedophiles come into the community, the police will have to do certain research to put them out, which the paramilitaries can just go down, put a death threat. So paramilitaries are good. Yes, there's bad things, but there's also good things that can happen. So again, this sense in which, swifter justice, even if it was arbitrary, even if it wasn't due process on all these kind of elements, but that it would be seen by some communities as more effective than formal justice institutions. But touching upon that, there's a huge ambivalence in young people's accounts of this kind of paramilitary roles. And what they talked about also was this kind of notion of kind of hypocrisy in relation to the sense in which, on one hand, their communities could be protected, and you could see then how this could be sustained within communities. But on the other hand, that in some contexts, paramilitaries, and obviously this differed from community to community, but in some, young people would describe them as basically business gangsters. They're basically controlling trade on the turf in relation to drugs, and that's basically what they're about. And, any kind of sense of protection, it comes at this sort of price. So alongside all of these kind of different accounts of young people is this sense of this ambivalence, this tension between so-called protection and this notion of, they're doing good for the community, but as Linda there says in the last example, they shouldn't have the right to act as if they are the police, but nonetheless, this is what occurs within the communities. One of the aims of our study as well was to look at young people and whether there was kind of evidence, and this is something that's gained prominence recently as well, about joining paramilitaries. None of the young people in our sample had become involved themselves, and again that's probably a feature of sampling, and whether we would have access to young people who had actually become joined into paramilitaries would be much more a different type of studies. But when young people were aware of young people kind of becoming involved in paramilitary organisations, and they talked about the sense of becoming involved, young people doing dirty jobs, which perhaps might link to some of what Sean was talking about earlier in terms of networks. Because they feel power, you want to feel a bit more power, so you join. It's a way of protection, and it's a way of feeling better protected. So, you can see some of the kind of pulls for young people in this process also. But I've alluded to there, and it comes across in lots of the narratives, is this sense in which the legitimacy of formal institutions was something that was kind of an ongoing question throughout. And you can see why that might be the case in Northern Ireland. But it sounds, from what Sean was presenting, and certainly I don't know if Johnny will come on to talk about this, that there is a question about legitimacy of formal institutions in contexts where young people are experiencing these kind of arbitrary violence and they don't see justice happening for them. As I said, young people themselves, when we did our criminal justice study, had themselves been held to account through the criminal justice system. Now we can debate what we think about that, but they felt a kind of inherent hypocrisy that their sense of victimization wasn't being recognized, particularly in restorative justice processes, which is very much about a particular instance where you're restoring the harm in relation to one particular offence. Their sense was, well, what about all the stuff that's happened to me previously? That doesn't kind of come on the table, and nor would I feel safe about bringing it onto the table, indeed. Young people in this study and in the previous study would, under no circumstances, go to the police in relation to what they'd experienced. And part of what they said, was, I don't go to the police because the police wouldn't do anything, or they do nothing, and paramilitaries get away with everything. There's this sense in which, as I was saying there, that paramilitaries are seen as more effective in terms of swifter justice, and people think that, conversely, paramilitaries make the communities safer. So all of this is kind of contributing to this notion of this kind of cycle of exclusion, in particular in the particular communities that we studied. In some instances, young people talked about kind of resisting, and there's a colloquial term used for young people, they sometimes call themselves, I'm a hood. I'm not involved in paramilitarism, I'm involved in antisocial behaviour or criminality. And having the identity of a hood is, about kind of, being resistant to some of this type of thing. But some people young people who talked about, I'm a hood, I get involved in antisocial behaviour, etc., but I'm not part of that, would experience more punishment within their communities as a result. And this resistance, as we kind of analysed it in relation to the young people we talked to, led to, and as justification for them, for further kind of exclusion and punishment in their community. So this way of kind of standing up to it, even in negative senses, has continued kind of negative effects. And we talked about, this is a poster that was visible in the communities. One of the young people in the study talked about, I'd rather get shot than be a tout. That's the kind of, sense in which the idea of going and reporting some of these instances and not being able to access those forms of justice. So there's a kind of, issue around access to justice for young people, speed of justice and for the community, and the legitimacy deficit. And this kind of cycle kind of maintains this violence within particular communities and reproduces violence as we establish it. So, as I said, none of the young people in our particular sample talked about being part of paramilitary groupings. But what they did talk about was the kind of cultural factors, such as family and community, but also structural and political factors, such as lack of opportunities, political and social marginality, sometimes the search for kind of, a particular identity, proving manhood, etc. And these kind of impetuses or kind of drivers of social exclusion were part of kind of the replication of these cycles. Now, recently there has been discussions about kind of higher profile visibility about tackling paramilitarism within Northern Ireland. And, some of that is framed in the context of kind of like, these are gangs, these are not kind of legitimate in any other way. But I think from our research and from wider research, we would certainly make the argument that it's really important to ground analysis or interventions within historical understandings. It isn't about plopping something in or dropping something in like a program that's going to magically address this issue. It's about recognizing issues around marginality more broadly and that socio-historical context. And nowhere is that kind of more true than in Northern Ireland. But at the other hand, on the other side of it, we have this Stormont Agreement, which is about a fresh start. That does talk about starting to address paramilitarism, but also talks about legacies of the past and the need to address those. And you probably heard those in discussions about reforming a government within Northern Ireland. As it stands, there is no government, and one of the things that young people talked about was kind of their access to any sort of voice, and it seems kind of, even more amplified, that kind of silence when there isn't even a kind of like political a policy to even take forward some of these issues at the moment. So just to kind of conclude what I'm talking about here, I mean, our focus on paramilitary punishment in particular is this notion about needing to expand the penalty lens. Our research shows evidence of persistent paramilitary activity in communities. There is a clear issue about hidden victimization, assaults, intimidations, criminality not reported to police or other authorities. And as I said, it's not just about policing in relation to this. For under 18s in particular, the child protection system should apply, or does apply. And these are child protection concerns when you're talking about young people being subject to physical abuse, essentially, or emotional abuse in different contexts. Young people have concerns regarding repercussions of reporting to the police. There are issues around confidence in policing, and this wider question links to wider questions of legitimacy, which leads to underreporting and then leads to this compounding effect of invisibility. But also, and I think this is important because it does come through in young people's narrative, there was support for paramilitaries within communities, but that's underscored with a sense of ambivalence. This sense of, they deal with particular issues is very ambivalent in relation to then describing kind of assaults upon young people themselves. I think what all of this does as well, and it's something that I'd just be keen to highlight in the context of our discussions here, and particularly when we talk about restorative justice in relation to some of these things, is that there is a need to kind of reconsider our kind of binary offender-victim dichotomizations, particularly in restorative justice terms, I would argue. But also, what we've uncovered is these are the kind of issues facing young people that may be labelled otherwise as offenders. The extent of their victimisation is something that really needs to be highlighted, and no doubt has impacts on their behaviour, as evidence here, and just in relation to what some young people have said. And finally, certainly what we're arguing in terms of feeding back to our stakeholders in Northern Ireland is that there's a clear need to address the impact of activities of paramilitaries from a children's rights perspective and from a broader rights perspective. So thank you very much.
Right, my name is Johnny Connolly, and I'm based here in the Law School in the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies on an Irish Research Council scholarship, which is in collaboration with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And the title of the research I'm working on at the moment is Developing a Comprehensive Human Rights-Based Response to Drug and Gang-Related Crime and Community Violence. And it is the sort of the community violence element I want to talk about in this presentation. And the presentation is based on a study I did for an organisation called Citywide, or the Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign, which was established in around 1995. It's now a national organisation of mostly of community groups, family support groups in response to drug issues. Now, it's not just focusing on, it doesn't just focus on the issue of drug-related crime, but this was an area, the issue of intimidation and debt-related intimidation was an issue that has come to the fore over the last number of years. I want to talk a little bit about the background to that and the sort of the impact that the impact it's having that is largely hidden. It's not really on the radar, so that's what this study and discussion is about. The title of the report, which you can get online, is "Demanding Money with Menace." Now, firstly, I'm going to just go through some basic concepts that I'm going to use, but I don't want to be presumptuous, and I want to just talk about some of the sort of the meanings of some of the concepts that I'm going to be touching on. I'll talk a little bit about the background to the research, a very brief look at the methodology, which I think is quite important. When you're trying to access information about something that is largely hidden, the hidden activities of a hidden market, of a drug trade, it's quite difficult, particularly where it's highly sensitive. It's a highly sensitive issue. You don't want to do any harm to the people who have the information, who are under threat, for example. But it's essential that you do access this information, because otherwise it can be denied by policymakers. It's not a problem. It's not reported. It doesn't exist. And yet it is a huge issue. So research has a purpose here in that it is trying to expose this hidden reality, and how you access that information is quite tricky. I'm going to talk about some of the key findings with a particular focus on the whole concept of hidden victimization, and then touch on some of the policy implications, and hopefully then we can have a chat about all the three presentations, which I think are very much overlapping in loads of different ways. So firstly, a term that I detest is the term gangland. It is widely used in the media. It is widely used by policymakers. I was in February of last year, I was in front of the Oireachtas Justice Committee, which was discussing gangland, and the first thing I said, well, what do you mean? They asked me to come and talk about it. I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I've worked in this area for a long time, and I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. But it's a term that even policymakers are beginning to use. I think it's a very problematic term, because are we talking about land that is controlled by gangs? If we are, and policymakers are using that term, well, that's fairly frightening. Has the state abandoned these areas to gangs? Is the state admitting that it has no control over these areas? What we are talking about are communities in which gang-related crime can emerge, but often we might be talking about loose networks of individuals. If we use the term gang, what does that mean? Are we talking about a hierarchical organization? Are we talking about an ethnic grouping, etc.? And so policymaking often begins with this presumption that we know what we're talking about, and really we haven't done any analysis of it at all. It simplifies the problems that we're talking about, and I would argue it pathologizes the problem. We're talking about, you have the Mr. Big, as the books go, the king scum, gangland figures, the lieutenants. All of this terminology is used. It pathologizes both the idea of the gang, in a sense that everything is controlled from the top, like mafia style, and it pathologizes the drug user also. You've got the junkie, the desperate junkie who will do anything to get their next fix, all of which is inconsistent with the evidence as we know it. And so I suppose where I begin with is a cry for evidence, for research, and some of the work that we're talking about today, I think, is a very important start. Secondly, what we're talking about is a market. It is a market because drugs are illegal, and they're in widespread demand. It has created a market, an extremely profitable and lucrative market. There is demand. Once there's demand, there will be supply. So how do we understand these markets? And what are the scale of these markets, the sort of money that we are talking about? The concept of systemic violence is something that originates with some work that was done in around the 1980s in New York, primarily. A writer called Goldsmith, who talked about this idea of drug-related crime as incorporating three different elements. We sort of assume that there's a natural relationship between illicit drug use and criminal offending or criminal behavior. But actually it's quite a complex relationship or nexus between illicit drugs and crime. But generally it's understood as involving three dimensions. Firstly, the psychopharmacological connection, which is that there is something in the drug itself that contributes to the criminal behavior. For example, with alcohol, this is fairly well established, alcohol and violent behavior. The second is the economic compulsive argument that people who become dependent or addicted to drugs, their offending behavior increases, and if they get proper resourced treatment, their offending behavior decreases. So that is the economic compulsive argument that they are committing crime to feed their habit, essentially. And the final dimension of the drugs-crime connection is the systemic dimension. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And this is the crimes that involve the illegal, the hidden market, essentially. In research that I have done over the years, most of the crime associated with the illicit drug trade is to do with debt collection. Sometimes you might have crimes around territory, around the control of territory. You might have violence around people who are informers, etc. And of course, you see what's going on in Dublin at the moment, which is quite an unusual situation in that type of violence associated with the feud in Dublin. It's not really a feud, but between the Kinahan and the Hutch groups is quite unusual in that it's not very good for business. But there's a family dimension to it which probably intensifies it, etc. But most of the violence associated with the illicit drug trade, in our experience, as far as the research goes, is to do with debt collection, and that's what I want to talk about. And then the concept of a host community. Drug markets tend to emerge in certain communities, particularly open drug markets in heroin, in crack cocaine, etc. Particularly sort of visible markets, often in areas with high levels of social and economic deprivation. But also the drug trade can bring things, not just sort of negative things into a community. They can have a sort of a symbiotic relationship with what are called our host communities, in that they can bring in cheap goods, they bring in money, to young people that often wouldn't have access to cash, and often for people who are very opposed to the local drug trade, they might also benefit from it in terms of cheap goods, materials. And this creates an ambiguous relationship that policymakers need to be aware of. That in areas with very, like, for example, I was looking at the recent Kieran Mulvey report on the North Inner City, you're talking about a trade of hundreds of millions of euros. In the heroin trade alone, it has been estimated by the UN that the heroin trade in Ireland is worth around 600 million. Now, while I think that's an exaggeration, I'd say it's probably almost around half of that. It is still far more than we spend on the drug issue, on direct drug spending. So that's the economy that we are talking about. Now, to talk a little bit about the evolution of the illicit drug market, I suppose the Dunns were a family that were associated with introducing heroin into Dublin in the 1980s. And there was always a famous saying, apparently by Larry Dunn, who was one of the main figures in the family, that if you think I am bad, wait until what comes after me. Now, the Dunns, it was said at one stage, controlled around 50% of the drug trade in the city. And what that tells us is that 50% of the drug trade wasn't controlled by the Dunns. And that's an important thing to consider, because they were probably the beginning of this idea of the whole drug trade being controlled by the top, by single figures, single individuals. In 1996, you had a sort of a watershed, you could say, in the sense of you had a resurgence of heroin use in the inner city. You had a huge number of drug-related deaths. You had people moving into heroin, a lot of it associated with the consumption of ecstasy as part of the rave culture. People beginning to smoke heroin to come down off ecstasy, and so you had a resurgence of heroin. And then, of course, you had the assassination of Veronica Guerin in the summer of 1996. And there's the state response to that, which was the introduction of a series of fairly severe criminal justice measures. At the same time, more quietly, you had the National Drug Strategy, which was also came about really largely around 1996 with the Rabbit Report, named after Pat Rabbit, which for the first time the state acknowledged that the drug problem in Dublin and in inner city areas was associated with poverty. Now, this was obvious, of course, going back decades, but it had never been publicly acknowledged in policy documents that you had to deal with the issues of poverty if you were going to properly deal with the drugs problem. You then had, I suppose, during the so-called Celtic Tiger period, the emergence of cocaine. Right across the social spectrum, the emergence of crack cocaine in Dublin in around 2005 or thereabouts. And then, of course, what you have now, at least in Dublin, of course, and throughout many other cities around the country, you have a poly-drug situation. You have new psychoactive substances, you have the head shop phenomenon as well, and so you've got a far more complex drug trade, and you have, of course, the dark net, and you don't even need the dark net, you have the internet, basically, so you've got quite a very readily easy access to drugs, and I suppose is a very quick overview of the drug trade. Now, the issue of violence is a bit more complex. And I want to just throw out, firstly, a quote from Tony Gregory, who was interviewed, the late Tony Gregory, who was a TD and very prominent in dealing with drug issues. He said, at the beginning, I do know that in the initial stages of the heroin thing, the most prevalent reaction was one of fear. The people who were involved were known to be heavies, and people were afraid to be burnt out of their flats. They were afraid for their kids' sake. That was him speaking before he died. A quote then from Niamh Hurricane's study, Understanding Limerick, about the impact of what was going on in Limerick on local communities. You know what they really want is for you to be down on yourself so that you don't believe you can have any other life. They want you to keep your head down and just put up with it. Even if there are gunshots coming in your window and you're lying on the floor with your kids, what they want is for you to keep your head down and just shut the fuck up and accept that's your life, full stop. And a quote from a guy I interviewed in Mountjoy as part of a study on illicit drug markets in 2014. Violence, it was always part and parcel of you get stigmatized, drugs. With drugs comes violence, and it's true. With drugs comes violence, but I was never violent. I was always sympathetic to those who went off them, always. I would never go around, as they do now, fucking like tapping on doors, looking for the owl fella, looking for the fathers or mothers to pay, but I was never like that. I would write it off more times out of 10, if I got out of pocket from doing it, but I would never use violence. And this is something that there has been a sort of a change in the nature, the qualitative nature of the drug trade in terms of violence since probably around the early 2000s or so. In that, as Tony Gregory said, violence was always there. When you had armed robbers moving into the drug trade, they were heavies. But it was a violence that was generally maintained between those involved in the trade, between the sellers and the buyers. It was something that generally didn't impact on the broader community or on the relations of those involved immediately in the drug trade. And it was something that began to be seen in the limited amount of research that has been done in the area. In a study I did around the setting up of a community policing system in the North Inner City in around 2002, the issue of fear of reprisal from those involved in the drug trade was beginning to be identified. Again, in a study I did in the North Inner City, monitoring quality of life, again, people were expressing, and this was a time shortly after you had the big marches in the mid-1990s, and people demanding a response to the drug trade. Now, in around 2000, 2002, 2003, people were more fearful to be obviously identified with responding to the drug trade. In the National Advisory Committee on Drugs commissioned a study that was published in 2006, a community drug study, and again, the issue of fear of reprisal of those involved in the drug trade was very highly was one of the main findings that they came up with. Understanding Limerick again was a study that Niamh Hurricane did, which showed the extent of this in certain areas of Limerick. A study done by it wasn't an academic study, but a study done by a guy called Philip Jennings in Blanchardstown in Dublin. He referred to this as an iceberg of fear, different layers of an iceberg involving loads of different people in the community, from very, very young people to more serious players. A study I conducted then in 2004 involved, a part of that study involved a survey of around 800 people in 4 drug markets throughout the country, or 4 areas with sort of active drug markets throughout the country. And again, fear of reprisal from those involved in the drug trade was the dominant reason why people didn't talk to the police, why people didn't engage in responses to the problem. And this was something that the Citywide Drugs Crisis campaign realized it had to take on. And because in community meetings throughout the country, when they started developing their policy documents, fear, along with particularly during the cutbacks, during the austerity era, the issue of cutbacks, of course, to local services was number 1 on the agenda, but number 2 was intimidation, drug debt intimidation, and the way this was impacting on families and communities. In around 2013, I presented a sort of a research proposal as to how we would look at this and how we would access information about it, because they realized citywide that you had to put some sort of figure on it. You had to put some sort of data together if you were going to get any sort of policy response, which is what they're about. So the objective of the research was to access the hidden experience of drug-related intimidation and community violence throughout the country. To use that evidence to highlight the situation to policymakers in the wider public, to look at international best practice responses to the issue and national responses, to present the outcomes throughout the country to the various drugs task forces, and to assist communities in developing locally based, effective, sustainable responses. The methodology involved 2 sort of main aspects. One was an audit, and this was an audit where community groups and different organizations at a community level, where people came in and reported that they were being intimidated or that they were being threatened. What they would then do is to, in a sort of a questionnaire that I designed, a very simple questionnaire, they would put this data into a questionnaire with some basic information. And it was information that they had and they were dealing with all the time, but it was something that was never been routinely recorded. It would be confidential, anonymous, and not too resource intensive. And then it would be, it involved a sort of an A4 page with 16 tick box questions. And then we eventually got data on around 140 incidents of intimidation throughout the country over an 18-month period. I then conducted a series of focus groups throughout all the tasks, at least 13 task force areas, and a series of focus groups with travellers, with former prisoners, with youth workers, with community safety fora, and with family support workers, totaling 150 people. The key findings included, the evening. Often we think, and criminological research looks at the way in which crime can become a greater problem after it gets dark. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is the way in which social media has impacted on this, and particularly in the area of debt and intimidation. And that it can happen at any time of day or night. It can be repeated. It can be continuous. Because of social media has provided that means where people can be threatened or intimidated on a 24-hour basis, basically. The intimidation or violence is generally directed at the drug user, the person in debt. And then, secondly, the main person who would be directed would be the mother of the drug user. But it impacted on numerous members of the family, to brothers, sisters, siblings, grandparents, and particularly if debts were paid, or if there was a possibility that debt could be paid. For example, if If there was nobody employed in the immediate family, but there was an uncle who had a good job, the debt would then could be transferred over to the uncle, or the pressure could be transferred over to the uncle, etc. So it impacted on everyone, but particularly mothers, and this was something we'll come back to. The incidents were reported to the community centres, etc., mostly by the victim, but also by the victim's mother. And I use victim here, in a sense that they were under threat. They were, of course, people who were involved in the drug trade. They got into debt themselves as a consequence of their drug use. And there also was a sense in which people, as we'll talk about, were entrapped into the drug trade because they might get into debt very quickly. A big issue in Dublin over the last couple of years, at least, I'm not sure about Limerick or elsewhere, is the issue of weed, where people are smoking over a weekend and suddenly at the end of a weekend they're in €200 worth of debt. And they thought they were getting it, it was for free, and suddenly they now have a debt of €200, and they thought, okay, if you just hold on to this bit of drugs or that, etc., or transfer this from A to B, well, then we'll write off half your debt, etc. So people becoming implicated in the drug trade in that way. Mothers often become key targets because often they're more likely to pay the debt. And to keep it away, if there's a father who's around or a male partner, they might react aggressively to the situation. This is something we found from focus groups. So often mothers would be the target of the debt. It's also, by focusing on the mother, would be a way of flushing out the drug user. Also we found in focus groups often drug users would coerce their mother into paying off the debt, or other family members. So you can imagine the sort of the impact that the debt can have within the family home. The main reasons behind the intimidation or violence, of course, were to reclaim a drug debt, or to frighten people, to obtain money, and then often if somebody did pay a debt, well, then they were seen as a soft touch, and then it now just became a form of extortion. To enforce gang control in an area, to enforce silence regarding local drug dealing. These are numerous reasons that were seen to be behind the intimidation or the violence or the threats. The nature of the incidents, from verbal threats, mostly verbal threats, all the way up to physical violence, damage to the home or property. We find a lot of cases of family pets being killed, etc. So a whole range of different forms of intimidation were used. Being forced to carry drugs, being forced to sell drugs, or being forced to hold drugs were also means of paying off a debt, or people being told to pay off a debt. The sort of money we're talking about, in most cases, we're talking about between €1,000 and €5,000, which is a huge amount of money when you think about it. Particularly during times if you've no job, trying to come up with that sort of money is basically impossible. There were many situations where previously people would take credit union loans, and then the credit unions began to realise that loans, were being used to pay drug debts. We're talking about, mostly we're talking about males involved, about 80% of cases, but in most cases it was also groups of peers that were involved in the intimidation. We're talking about from the age of 18 to 35 would be the main group involved, and I was interested in Sean's, we can talk a little bit about this idea of desistance out of crime. We're talking about a very broad range of people. There was a general sense amongst everybody that debts had to be paid. That was part of the deal, and this was generally accepted by families. It was ex-prisoners, so I spoke to, there was no doubt about it, debts had to be paid. What actions did families take? Mostly they paid the debt. Very few, only 17% would report the incidents. And for many others, they would simply either take no action, so they'd take a calculated risk. Maybe is this person a heavy? Are they connected to heavies? Maybe I'll pay the debt, maybe I won't. So they're making those sorts of calculations, or they'd simply try and avoid those involved or their families, etc. If they reported it previously, who did they report it to? And mostly people reported to community networks or to community services or to people they knew and people they trusted. And in no cases were people interested in a criminal prosecution. They might report it to the Gardaí on the basis that it wouldn't go any further, or if community groups reported them to the Gardaí, but on the basis that it wouldn't proceed any further. And the main reason they didn't was because of fear of reprisal from those involved in the drug trade. And one of the reasons, of course, is not just fear of reprisal, it's that even if there was a prosecution, that wouldn't end the situation. People can still be intimidated from within prison, so there was no safety net, basically, whatsoever within the criminal justice system as far as many people were concerned. It just didn't have an answer for them. There's a range of consequences. You can get these presentations. I know I'm getting a nod here from Owen, so I don't want to sort of be inconsistent with the other two presenters who were both on time. So there's a range of consequences, obviously, which we can all understand. Impact on the home and family life is massive in terms of trying to deal with these issues on an ongoing basis within the family home and within family relationships. Fear for safety in the local area. And this is, I suppose, one of the important points about this is that when we talk about fear of reprisal, when the Central Statistics Office conducts its victimization studies every couple of years, it asks people, were they ever a victim of crime? And if they were, did they report the crime? And if people say, I was a victim of crime, but I didn't bother reporting it, there's a list of reasons why people don't report crime. I couldn't be bothered, there was no point, the guards wouldn't do anything, the guards couldn't do anything, there was no insurance claim, etc., etc., right down to fear of reprisal. That never appears, really, as a reason why people in general society don't report a crime. And the reason they don't is because it's very unlikely that they're going to know the offender. However, in this type of research, fear of reprisal is the number one reason why people don't report crime. And it shows you the way in which drug-related crime is class-specific, you could say. It doesn't impact broadly across society in the same way. Young people, some of the issues, I suppose, coming out of it, the issue of intimidation in school was a major figure. Fear of attack over debt in school, young people being forced to hold drugs, youth and community workers facing very difficult situations as to how to deal with this issue. Can they report it? Who they report it to? What can they actually do? What sort of support can they provide either to young people or their families? I believe sort of that there's very little that can be done. Workers are afraid to speak about it to Gardaí. Some in the community view community workers themselves as rats, and people feel intimidated going to work trying to deal with it. People struggling to pay debts. We've had reports of people selling houses and then being pressurized by the council to have money, which they don't have because they've sold their house to pay debts. Interest on money, debts being passed on to other figures to collect. Even when people pay debts, sometimes the debt doesn't disappear, it escalates, or it becomes a different type of debt, and it just becomes a form of extortion. To finish, I suppose, the 6 key issues that we need to look at further. Firstly, the issue of recording information. This is all hidden data, basically. It's something that is generally not reported, and even if it is reported, it is not recorded by the Gardaí anywhere, generally. What we're looking at the moment with work I'm doing with some community groups in Dublin is looking at community impact statements, a way of trying to identify the impact of drug-related crime on a community, how you can sort of count it effectively. How mothers, there is a strong gender dimension to this issue, and the targeting of mothers is an issue that I think requires particular attention. What supports can be provided? Dealing with young people and the pressure on young people in terms of gang formation, being pressured into involvement in gangs. Supporting community services who are confronting and dealing with these types of issues on a day-to-day basis. Often it takes massive resources dealing with, particularly with debts, because they can escalate. And a problem can escalate from verbal threats to serious violence, and this can take up to 6 months, a year, where community workers are trying to deal with this and negotiate solutions to it with limited support. People's fear of reprisal and their unwillingness to engage with the authorities, I think, is a crisis for the criminal justice system. How that is addressed is something that I think we can discuss, and I think it's similar to Nicola's presentations, that this is happening outside of the official system. And then, of course, then coming back to the nub of the issue, and I'll finish with this, is the issue of drug supply and engaging with the reality that drugs are illegal. This creates a market, and these are the consequences of that market. And policymakers have to address that question, the so-called war on drugs, and the impact it is having, and whether that policy of criminalisation is a legitimate policy to continue with. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Johnny. You're way ahead of schedule there, so thank you very much. You're perfect. At this stage, we'd like to open things up to the audience as much as possible to try and keep it as informal, direct the questions at the lads. You can see we've set up a lovely opera style. Someone mentioned that to me this morning. Some lovely, comfortable couches. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could take seats. And hopefully the three presentations have generated discussion amongst yourself at the break, and hopefully you have some questions. If you wouldn't mind just throwing some rules, could you just put up your hand and we'll try and make it as orderly as possible. Maybe just give your name, first name is fine, and the organisation you represent.
My name is Lynn Campbell. I'm here from the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity, and I have a question for Sean on his project. I just wondered, in the design of your project, did you ever consider actually interviewing the young people or the families involved in that particular community?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In fact, one of the limitations of the study, if you get a chance to have a read of it, says that one of the kind of deficits was not getting a kind of a rounded view about experience. So there's two things really. Anybody who's kind of doing their PhD knows that there are resources for a lone researcher involved in kind of trying to do stuff and trying to kind of execute things. So there was partly kind of resource issues around that. Secondly, I suppose there was also kind of not necessarily ethical issues, but also, and it's a kind of a judgment call really, I felt in the community that we were looking at that there were potential ethical issues involved in talking to young people about people they had close relationships with, and that there may be kind of a risk element to that as well. This is a very kind of small community. On the flip side to that, I was kind of swayed. First of all, the guards said that they were interested in giving a kind of a perspective on this, on a local perspective. And there's some interesting kind of commentary on, if you were kind of stuck with one data point, where would you go? The kind of police perspective is much broader than, particularly in Ireland, much broader than a kind of law and order kind of agenda. So yes, I did consider it. Resource, potentially ethical, but also data issues stopped me from thinking about interviewing children, young people and families. If we was doing it again with more resources and more time, then yes, think about how to do that. But also, I actually think that talking to local Garda about their direct experiences over a long period of years was actually a fresh perspective as well.
Okay, thanks for that. So, questions? Perfect, here we go.
Thanks very much. They were all very interesting questions. I suppose, Johnny, can you say, are you in favour of decriminalisation or legalisation? And as regards the targeting of mothers, maybe it didn't emerge in the research, but what was the principal reason for them paying over the sums of money? Was it fear, do you think, for their own safety, or fear for their family members' safety, or perhaps guilt? Did any of that kind of detail emerge in the study? And do you think as well there might be consequences, say, for people getting out of prison not being received in the family home because of these type of issues following them? And what, if anything, can the prison system do to intervene to kind of prevent these community issues that might kind of be amplified in prison? So a lot of questions there.
Questions. I'm going to stop you halfway, but I think the first one's around kind of legalisation, that kind of stuff. Yeah, it would have been parts.
Well, yeah, I'm in favour of decriminalisation, and I would say decriminalisation as a step towards some form of legalisation or regulation. But I say that in, often the issue of, well, firstly, the issue of decriminalisation and legalisation are often confused, firstly. And I would, like increasingly now there's been talk about the process of decriminalisation as has been adopted in Portugal, which I think is a very positive approach in that it's the decriminalisation of the personal possession of all drugs for personal use. And it's taken out of the criminal justice process entirely. Into a sort of a more or what's called a dissuasion committee, where you're talking to social workers, health workers, etc. And if people have problematic or dependent drug use, that can be addressed in that forum and without giving them a criminal record. But that doesn't take away the criminal dimension. It doesn't take away the issue of drug supply. And that still has to be addressed. So long as there is demand, as I mentioned, there still will be supply. So how you still have to deal with that issue of this very lucrative market. What does it look like is something I wouldn't be aware of, and I think often, in debates, it's seen as a sort of a liberal issue. And I think the head shop phenomenon was a very interesting one, because I know from just seeing it in Dublin, people's exposure to more easily available drugs did have an impact on their use, and so it questioned this whole idea that that restrictions on availability, the idea that it didn't matter whether drugs were available. It does matter. It will have an impact to a certain degree. So that's something that has to be grappled with. Now, so I say decriminalisation as a step towards regulation, considering it, and policymakers engaging with it, because we should be engaging with that. It's a democratic country. We have enough intelligence and wit to look at these issues. What we're doing at the moment isn't working. So what does regulation or legalisation look like? I don't really know. Is the answer. But we have regulated alcohol, we have regulated tobacco, so we have to start thinking at least about what that might look like, because what is there at the moment isn't satisfactory. With regards to mothers paying the debt, well, I think the question was why were they targeted? Well, we sort of discussed this in various focus groups around the country and with family support groups. And, often their first motivation is to protect their son, generally, from being attacked. Sometimes for many parents, when somebody knocks on the door looking for a drug debt to be repaid, it's the first time they realise that their kid is actually using drugs. And so that's a hugely challenging situation for many mothers. So firstly, there's the danger associated with this individual who's willing to knock on their door, demanding money for their behaviour of their son that they didn't even realise what was happening. So they want to get that situation resolved. And it's not really about themselves, I don't think, in any sense. I don't think it's about protecting themselves. It's about trying to make the problem go away. But then what becomes problematic, and this is a tricky one for the guards, because like in a lot of, this won't be officially acknowledged, of course, by the guards, but in many cases the guards tell people to pay the debt. Some guards do. Other guards say don't pay the debt, because you're going to be seen as a soft touch and they're going to keep coming back for more. So it's a dilemma in that situation as well. And one thing that was established by the Family Support Network in association with the guards was a sort of a program whereby people could be given support. So parents would often come to projects or the Family Support Network simply looking for some sort of support. They're very stuck as to what to do, but they need somebody to talk to as to what their potentials are. The final issue with regards to prison, I think, is a very serious one, because there's a lot of violence in prisons associated with debt, with drug debt outside the prison, that follows people into the prison and follows them out of the prison and impacts on their families outside the prison. So there's very little escape from drugs. And also something like sometimes, for example, if the guards make a drug seizure that is seen broadly by society as a very positive thing. It's reducing the amount of drugs that are available in society. But the drugs still have to be paid for. Once you have possession of the drugs, even if they're seized from you by the guards, you still have to pay for them. You still owe for that. And that debt has to be paid somewhere along the line. And so it's an unintended negative consequence of good law enforcement, that it actually can create further violence as a consequence of the debt being carried on. So I think the prison issue is a major one. How that is negotiated is something that maybe the prison service could think about within the prison.
Thanks. John, you had, yeah?
Yeah, so, panel, just in response to that last question, sorry, John Flanagan is my name. I'm a sergeant in Henry Street in Limerick. I just want to thank the panel for their fascinating presentations. We came here today with 20 new probationer Gardaí that are working in disadvantaged areas of Limerick City at this moment in time, so I can say for all of them, I'm sure they found this very fascinating. Just in relation to the drug intimidation, I suppose An Garda Síochána has inspectors appointed throughout the country who it is their direct responsibility to engage and liaise with people who are reporting drug intimidation, and I'm sure Dr. Paddy was aware of that. And I suppose interagency cooperation in terms of youth workers and people that are coming to other organisations with information around drug intimidation. It's very important that interagency cooperation is going on and liaising with each other to support somebody that's reporting that. And I just wanted to say that that's what An Garda Síochána has in place in respect of drug intimidation that's taking place at a very serious level, and strategies and a process can come into place in terms of supporting a mother or a father or sibling of someone who is under drug intimidation. Just in relation to the points, I suppose, specifically for Dr. Sean and Dr. Paddy, in relation to possible solutions for the problems you've identified in your research, would it be fair to say, or would you strongly support, or can the Gardaí do more in respect of criminal asset bureau activity or criminal asset profiling, which is currently underway at a divisional level, so that we can identify these people that are enjoying the trappings at a lower level, in terms of maybe nice cars, nice clothing, nice equipment, that's creating an impression onto young people, leading them to think that this is a very attractive lifestyle, and it enhances their protectiveness, or the bubble of protection that they enjoy within local communities. That if the Gardaí, I suppose, at a divisional level, we have Criminal Assets Bureau working at a national level, but maybe more so at a more focused divisional level in these estates. Is that something that you could think, if it's enhanced, or can more be done to remove the bubble of protection that these guys that these guys enjoy?
Well, this is something that communities have been looking for 30 years, localised criminal assets bureaus. I mentioned Tony Gregory, and they were talking about it in the 1980s. It was always resisted. The Department of Finance always resisted on the basis that all of the money that was seized was going into the national coffers, and the drug strategy was being paid from that, so it was all the same anyway. But increasingly now it has been acknowledged there is a need to address the sort of middle-ranking or lower-ranking ill-gotten gains, as it were. And I have heard in Dublin in recent times that there's a commitment to do this at a lower level, at a divisional level. I think that isn't even far enough, in that it is also then what is done with those assets. Like I've been at conferences. I was at a conference in Manchester where we were collected by cars that had been seized from dealers, and I think returning the resources into like building a community centre from the assets seized from a drug dealer will have far more impact on young people locally than any amount of criminal laws or prison sentences, etc. And so I think that is where it is about symbolic. That's a sort of a symbolic change where people say, okay, that community centre that I go to every day is seized from that guy who's now doing 6 or 7 years or whatever. Has a far more powerful effect on a local community. And I'd see that's where I think it's not just the seizure of assets, it's what you then do with the assets and return that money that came from that community back into that community.
I just might add to that. I think when we start looking at kind of solutions, particularly in relation to network disruption and the perceptions that people have in local communities, should definitely be one of the things on the table. I think we need to be very clear. This is why I was making the point before that with these kind of complex kind of situations, you have to be really, really careful about kind of doing something unless you know what the potential kind of consequences of that might be, which is why it's important, I think, to kind of deliberate over it and think, well, if this happened, you know, what are the likely outcomes here? Because, as I say, I've been around long enough to see loads of things that seem intuitively and sometimes scientifically appropriate go a bit haywire because the local context wasn't taken account of. Having said that, intuitively, I think the idea of asset stripping people who have a proximal relationship, particularly with young people who are involved in drugs sale and burglaries, and they were the ones I was kind of more interested in at the retail end, you know, they'd be kind of with children. I think that it would have an important symbolic value, whether it has a financial value or not, an important symbolic value of that idea of omnipotence. But again, I would make the point that the thing that we looked at in Greentown, and it'll be interesting to see now whether this bears any resonance across the rest of the country, has been around for a long time. So transitory kind of CAB kind of campaigns, they sometimes then fall into a kind of a cycle then of things get back on track after a while, you know. So it's about how that kind of network suppression can be done over the long term. So I would be, I think, probably in the same court as Eddie on this, is that we really need to think about how we can kind of adjust the policy levers to support that work on the ground. But in answer to your question, I definitely think it should be one of the things that we consider when we start looking at you know, the potential solutions.
Okay, I think we're just coming close to a finish, and I'm going to risk being selfish here and ask Nicola a quick question, if that's okay. I suppose from the Greentown research, we're aware, and we've seen it there, there's a huge familial aspect to it. You know, family are the key to recruitment, almost in a rite of passage for some of these young people. Do you see that? Is there a comparison with that in some of the stuff that you're doing up the north? Can you see that kind of paramilitary involvement? You know, is there a family aspect to it as well? Is that something that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. In relation to certainly some of the communities that we researched in and interviewed young people talked about certain families being, you know, that you would get in trouble if you got involved in any sort of intimidation or inadvertently attacked somebody from a particular family. So very much there was families that were considered powerful and kind of networks. And I suppose also what was also interesting was the kind of huge interrelationships within communities between people who were subject to violence, people involved in violence, and the complex interlinking of different families in relation to that. So very difficult to disentangle in some way, but certainly, you know, kind of family lineages were clearly evident. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. And at this stage, can we just give a round of applause for our speakers? Amazing. The piece that Sean alluded to at the start, the thank yous, I think we need to hit a few here for the School of Law, definitely the CCJVS, Centre for Criminal Justice and Victim Studies. Susan, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you to yourselves for being here, for engaging with us. I hope this was useful for you. For those that stayed, we have a light lunch provided outside on your way. Again, hopefully you can hang around for a few minutes and generate some discussion out there. I think we'll be around for a few minutes ourselves. And the ITD as well, specifically, thank you very much for helping. We've videoed the event here today. Hopefully we'll be able to make it useful for people in the future. Alan, thank you very much. And thank you to the Chemie Business School in general. Cheers. Thank you.